Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream of Shabbat podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Boyce. And for those that are not familiar with Stephen, Stephen got his PhD in theology with a concentration in canonicity and textual criticism at Louisiana Baptist University and Theological Seminary. And he has a YouTube channel called The Facts Podcast. I have it tagged in the description below. So you want to go over there and subscribe, go ahead and do so. It's tagged right there in the description below, like I just said. And with that being said, welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jacob. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to the discussion.
And likewise, thank you for joining me today. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the Gospel of the Hebrews. What are the Gospels written by eyewitnesses? Yeah, so I want to start with the eyewitness stuff first.
Okay.
And you've obviously heard of this a lot. That the names of the Gospels are added later. And I know that some pushback against that idea is that in the earliest manuscripts of Mark, Matthew, Luke that we have, and John, they do have that superscription on them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a hypothesis that they were added later. So a lot of us are skeptical that those titles were always there. They said that it was added later. They're assuming it was added later,
right?
But some of them will counter the pushback and say that even if it were always there, it doesn't mean it was written by people with those names. So, what do you think of all that? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I know a lot of people like to either go to the manuscripts to deny or to affirm the discussion. I find that difficult to do because some of the inscriptions we have at the best are 2nd century, and I mean late, most of which are in the 3rd. So it's kind of hard to say yes and no. What should be noted, the only time I ever used the manuscript tradition for the traditional authorship is just to show the consistency of it. We don't have a Gospel of Matthew that has the Gospel of, James in the same slot at the very head or the very beginning in the title or the inscription. We don't have another name but Matthew on all the accounts of the Matthews that we have. And same thing is true of Luke, and same thing as John and Mark. So that alone is the only time I would use that argument. What I like to appeal to particularly is when Augustine of Hippo, when he was writing about the criteria to investigate an original document, he pretty much gave 3 criteria. And I usually hold this not just toward the New Testament, but any kind of historical authorship that has been documented. How do we go back to original authorship? The first thing that he pointed out is there has to be some sort of contemporary support. So we're looking for contemporaries that knew the writers, who can speak on behalf of their writing and that they were involved in something, which we can get in that discussion. The second one is that they were giving information. We can look at the entirety of the writing and say, is it corroborated over time? Like I said, even in the manuscript tradition, do we find inconsistencies? Like one person attributes it to Matthew, one James, this person over here, Barnabas. What are we finding when we find the names and descriptions on it? Are we finding multiple or a corroborated effort in demonstrating through whether it's the transmission of the text, a statement from this church father, a statement from that church father, or what part of the world, over how many years? Are we able to corroborate the information over a period of time? That's his second criteria. The third one is there's an unbroken chain of evidence that when you start putting together all the corroborated evidence and looking at the contemporary support, the internal, the external, the critics, those that are for and against, are we finding an unbroken chain of custody where there's a consistency on every angle to come together on the authorship? And I think we can prove that for the 4 Gospels. So I would start with the criteria that even Augustine of Hippo left us as we demonstrate historical documents, because that applies across the board, not just for the New Testament Gospels.
I think I'd like to ask you about that in just a second, but
Sure.
but I want to talk about Papias to you in
Sure.
relation to that, because
Yeah.
there's some debate among scholars, like, is Papias' Mark really our Mark? What is he talking about with the preaching of Peter? He brings up Hebrew Matthew, of course, which I want to ask you for your thoughts on that as well. So let's start with Mark. What do you make of Papias' statement that Mark wrote down what Papias preached, or what Peter preached?
Well, Mark wrote down what Peter preached while in Rome. See, the thing is that this goes back to that second point. Now, Papias would be a contemporary because he was with John, and he mentions his eyewitnesses that he knew, specifically Aristion and John the Elder. And there's some dispute about that, whether John the Elder is a different John than John, the son of Zebedee, or are they two people, one person? I happen to take Jerome and a couple others' view. I think they're separate people, but that's another discussion for another day. Even if they're just one, he is claiming to be a disciple of those who knew John. And we even see this later, I mean, from Irenaeus and others saying that Papias was a hearer of John. So he was obviously around the ministry of John. We even have evidence within some of the late second century documents saying that he was the scribe for John to write the Gospel of John, that he was actually the penman behind John's Gospel. Now, that can't be corroborated, but again, it's a claim associating him with John so closely that he wrote a Gospel for him. Whether that was true or not, there's this regular thing going around in the church about Papias and his connection to the eyewitnesses. So he makes the claim that Mark, and he starts with Mark, as it relates to Peter preaching sermons in Rome. And that goes to that second point of Augustine of Hippo, right? Can that be corroborated, or is that an independent claim? Well, I think it actually can be corroborated because he mentions that Peter is the interpreter, Mark is the interpreter for Peter's sermons, and he wrote down those things as he remembered them. And he goes through, he describes the fact that Mark never knew the Lord. He wasn't actually traveling with the Lord. He wasn't a part of the eyewitnesses, but he's simply a scribe. He's simply a scribe for Peter, and that he didn't leave false statements. He actually wrote down exactly what he remembered from Peter. But he's not the only one that says that. And that word hermeneutes, I believe, is the one that he uses in that section there, that he is the interpreter for Peter. That's going to keep coming up later in other people's statements, because we find that what does that mean, hermeneutes? This is where we get the word hermeneutics. Many students who take an undergrad or go to some sort of seminary usually take a hermeneutic class, or more than one, or at least I hope. And what are you doing? Well, you're learning to interpret, explain, but it can also mean to translate. And I think that it's an accurate term, because I think what we find in Mark's gospel is that Peter was preaching an oral tradition. They are pressing Mark, because Peter's life is in jeopardy, to push some sort of written account before Peter dies. And so I think what Peter was doing was, he's a speaker, he's not a writer. And that seems to be the regular. We know he used Silvanus for his epistle in First Peter. So he was not much into writing. Silvanus was his amanuensis in First Peter. There's a lot of debate about Second Peter and the different stylistic writing there. But wherever we see Peter, he's talking. He's not writing. He's not a writer. So it would make sense for somebody who had more professionalism or skill, and it could be that Peter was partially illiterate and only trained up to a certain point, was never skilled with the pen. But Mark would have been a good guy, a good candidate to do that. And he would also be a horrible candidate to pick if people are making these gospels up. Why would you name a gospel after a no name, or if it is the John Mark of the New Testament, a coward who abandoned Paul's ministry and left? Why would you name a gospel after a guy who has a bad rep for most of the New Testament until Paul says now he's profitable, which I think is significant to what changed there, and that could be later in the discussion. But as we look at these manuscripts, and when we look at the evidence, we look at what Papias is saying as recorded by Eusebius, his statement about him being an interpreter comes up a lot, because that's what Irenaeus says in Against Heresies, Book 3. He also makes this statement: Mark the interpreter and follower of Peter does commence his gospel after his name. Tertullian, same thing, and Against Marcion. Mark was the interpreter of Peter, Clement of Alexandria. Mark wrote Peter's teaching while Peter was alive. Origen. The second gospel was according to Mark, who wrote it according to Peter's instruction. All of these statements so far, the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, same thing. Mark recorded, who is called Stumpy Finger, because he had fingers that were too small for the height of the rest of his body. He himself was the interpreter of Peter. Jerome says the same exact thing. He's the interpreter of Peter, and he wrote a gospel after Peter approved it. And so what we find over and over again is a corroborated effort to show all of these different church fathers, patristics, and documents are saying that Mark interpreted Peter's sermons, which I take to mean, by the way, that he actually turned an oral tradition into a written. I think that's what they're saying if you actually look at the evidence of what they're trying to convey in that word, hermeneutes. I think he's saying that he translated in the sense of he took an oral tradition and made it a written. And by the way, I think we have multiple places in Mark's gospel of evidence where it is actually poor writing, but good oration. And I think that what we can find in Mark's gospel, that these claims are actually true. It is a written text, but it was based out of oral tradition where Mark really is just writing down what somebody's preaching, even if it's considered bad writing. And so I think we can find multiple places of evidence of this in Mark's gospel. So Papias' statement is not independent. And I know what a lot of people say, well, all these other guys, they're just quoting and copying Papias. Well, no, they're not. And nor does Jerome say. Now, Jerome mentions a little bit of Papias in there, but Clement of Alexandria, in fact, what Eusebius was doing is when Eusebius quotes that section, he's corroborating Clement of Alexandria and Papias for Mark being behind the Gospel of Mark, not as two witnesses depending on each other, but he's actually using them as independent witnesses to corroborate him. And Eusebius was not a fan of Papias. If anybody reads his statements about Papias, he's not a fan. He seems to really dislike some of his interpretations, especially the book of Revelation. So for him to use Papias, he's not using him because he's got some favoritism issue. He's actually using him to say, here's an independent witness with another independent witness and another independent witness, and he's corroborating their testimony. We have consistency that Mark actually is behind this, and it is Peter's sermons that Mark is recording.
Can you go into a few examples of where there's good oration in Mark, but also
Sure.
poor writing going on at the same time?
Well, one of the things that Papias tells us is that Mark did not do this in any particular order, which I find that interesting because that ought to make you think immediately like, well, good writing would be chronological. I mean, think about Luke's gospel, how he starts it out. I have written to you an orderly account. And then he says it's perfect. In a sense, it's like, well, that's a little conceited. But he said that he was very, very careful to make sure that he presented a very orderly account. Papias is telling us that Mark did not. In fact, he wasn't interested in going in order. So that already is, and here's an example. I always use this one in class when I'm teaching either the seminary level or high school apologetics. When you look at Matthew and Mark's gospel, when Jesus curses the fig tree, you'll notice that the order is reversed as to when Jesus is coming and going when it comes to cursing the fig tree, whether it was leaving or coming from town to town. The order is backward in Matthew and Mark. And I always pose the question, we have a major issue with the Gospels. Either they are in full rivalry, disagreement, and Mark is being corrected by Matthew, or there's a bigger picture here, and the order of events is not as important to one writer, perhaps, as the other. And I think that when we can understand that Mark was not written in a particular order, I think that we actually don't worry about those things because the intention of the writing is not to give you an orderly account like Luke, who is claiming to do that. Now, if Luke comes in and starts changing orders of stuff, now we're going to have an interesting rival between the order of events because those two should be consistent because they're writing orderly accounts. John's gospel even says, this is the first miracle where Jesus glorified himself. This is the second, so there seems to be a lot of orderly information in even John's gospel. Another example of this is in Mark's gospel. There's sections, in our English Bible, roughly 3 chapters where Peter, if he is preaching a sermon, I find this intriguing. If he is speaking, Mark must have recorded a long sermon nonstop. Because what you find in the writing of Mark is that there is no clarity to the pronoun antecedent function. Over and over again, if you read it in your English Bible, you'll find it'll say Jesus said and Jesus did and all this. But if you actually go to the Greek text, it just keeps saying him, his, he, and there is no antecedent for almost 3 chapters in Mark's gospel. It's the English translation supplying Jesus's name there, so you don't forget who is he and who is him. It's almost like a little bit of a run-on. That's not really good writing to do that. You need to re-clarify your pronoun antecedent. And so it could be, it makes actual sense there. If Peter's preaching a single sermon and the audience is already clear on who he's talking about, and he's just going on about he, him, and his, and Mark's just sitting there writing it down, it would make sense that an oral tradition would treat the pronoun antecedent that way, as opposed to a written tradition. And there's many, many other examples just in how Peter is speaking within the group in the Gospel of Mark that is very distinct from how Matthew is recording it and how Luke is recording it. There's a lot of inside statements as if somebody is there talking, not somebody reporting what somebody was saying inside that group. Matthew is very much from a 1,000-foot view. It's kind of reporting the overall scenery and statement. Mark is very much inside the group, reporting explicit details and statements, especially when Peter's there, which points to him quite a bit. There's a lot of evidence where there's a Petrine influence that seems to be telling the story from his worldview, even in the Gospel of Mark. And I can give examples of that if you'd like. There's multiple examples in Mark's Gospel where it seems to be completely based around Peter being involved in the scene. Mark is like the 1,000-foot view, or Matthew is the 1,000-foot view. Mark is like a 10-foot view. And so we see evidence of that in multiple places in Mark's Gospel.
Yeah, I would like you to expand on that because other pushback that's given to the idea that Mark was writing down what Peter preached is that Mark appears to, at least some interpret it this way, that Mark is criticizing Peter, making Peter look bad. Therefore, he couldn't have been taking down in dictation what Peter had said. So, what are your thoughts about that?
No, that's an interesting point, and it just could be that Peter was being honest about what happened. And remember, there's multiple elements of Mark's gospel where it brings back Peter starts on the scene as the first disciple named out of the 12. When you get to John's gospel, we don't find that. It's not John giving us Peter precedence. It's actually this unknown, unnamed disciple and Andrew. And then we find later it's actually Andrew that introduced Peter to Jesus to begin with. We don't see that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially Mark. But when we look at the text of Mark's gospel, Peter is the first one on the scene. He's called by Jesus. He is the last one named at the resurrection. In fact, the message to the women was, tell my brothers and Peter that I'll meet him in Galilee. And it ends with a message for Peter to understand. So a couple of reasons why we can believe it's Peter that's actually giving this information. Number one, we find Peter at times speaking on behalf of everybody in the group. Like in Mark chapter 10, verse 28, you can find where Peter's speaking on everybody else's intentions. We also find him being addressed by Jesus in place of the rest of the disciples. For example, Mark 14:37, then he came and found them, know that's Peter, James, and John, sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you, singular, sleeping? Could you not stay awake for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray so that you, Peter, James, and John, plural, won't enter into temptation. In one single scene, Jesus is addressing all 3 of them, but Peter is getting singled out, but yet he's not, because the writer's admitting Jesus addressed all 3, but the individual correspondence and change of events is directed at Peter and then ends with the whole group, all of you stay awake. But he called Peter out. It could have been in real life when Jesus was on the earth. He explicitly said something to all 3 of them. But why is it that Mark's gospel only recollects a direct statement to Peter, but admits Jesus addressed all 3? So we find him speaking on behalf of all of the group of apostles, and then we find Jesus addressing him in place of the entirety of the group, or in this case, 3 of them. And then we find it combinationed. we find all three. In Mark 11:21-22, Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, this is the passage I was telling you about that's out of order, so to speak, in Mark 11. The fig tree that you cursed has withered. So Peter remembered. So the writer is telling us Peter's thoughts. How does the writer know Peter's thoughts? He remembered something and said, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered. Jesus replied to them, all of them, have faith in God. If you go back to Matthew's account, all of the apostles actually said, the fig tree you cursed, it's withered. Look, Rabbi, look what happened. It wasn't just Peter, which is why Mark's admitting Jesus responded to all of them, because they all brought up what happened. Why is it that Mark is honing in on Peter's remembrance and sharing his direct statement when all of them had something to say about it? Here's another example. We find when Peter's on the scene, Peter's perspective is given more details in comparison to the other apostles. We see this in Mark 8:27, all the way down to verse 33. We see it in Mark 9:5-6. We see it later on in Mark 14:27-30. Like in Mark 9:5-6, for example, Peter's motives are disclosed to the reader. How does the writer of the Gospel of Mark know Peter's motives? You can't. I mean, you can guess, but it predicts his actual motives. In Mark 14, Peter is physically removed from all the other disciples, and his story is automatically told apart from the rest of the group. Whereas in John's gospel, you find there's another disciple lingering around, John, the disciple that Jesus loved. He's lingering around, and there's multiple scenes being told, the campfire, to the trial, to the abandonment, back to the other disciples in their home hiding. I mean, Thomas's view, Philip's view, everybody's view is being told in John. Peter, the minute he is pulled away from the rest of the group, the whole narration is built around what happens to him leaving. That's very different from Mark or from Matthew and from Luke and definitely from John. Another example, when Peter understands something or misunderstands something, the writer of the Gospel of Mark sets the tone for the rest of his storytelling off of Peter's understanding and not understanding. Perfect example of this is in Mark 8:29-33. In Mark 8:29, Peter makes one of the greatest proclamations in all of the New Testament. You are the Christ. This whole statement, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, that major declaration that Jesus said, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you. And then he turns right around and rebukes Jesus, and Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. So Peter getting something or not getting something, the writer starts creating the narrative around Peter's understanding and misunderstandings. We see the same thing happen in Mark 14, verse 29 and following. Peter makes a bold proclamation of loyalty to Jesus above all the others. They may abandon you. I definitely will not. But then by the end of verses 66-72, he ends up denying Christ altogether. And the writer focuses in on that, his statement of loyalty above everybody else and his failure to hold it. But all the other disciples left Jesus too, except the beloved disciple. But the writer doesn't seem to focus on their error, but Peter's error. Just a couple other ones. Peter's involvement in gaining knowledge of the resurrection was distinguished from everybody else. Tell my brothers and Peter. As Dr. Bauckham points out in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the inclusio eyewitness format is used both in Mark and in John. Mark's gospel starts with Peter, ends with Peter. The Gospel of John starts with the unnamed disciple and Andrew and ends with this unnamed disciple who is revealed as the disciple Jesus loved, leaned up on Jesus' breast. And even in Mark's gospel, another one is the writer protects the identity of Peter in major crime situations. Like he doesn't reveal that it was Peter that hacked the ear off of Matthias or of Malchus, in the garden. You have to go to John's gospel to realize it was Peter that swung the sword, and it was Malchus's whose ear was chopped off, and Malchus's relative who called Peter out at the campfire during Jesus' trial. You don't get that from Mark because he's protecting the identity of Peter as an attempted murderer, where by the time John's gospel is written, Peter's dead. It doesn't really matter. He can unveil everything. So we see a lot based around Peter just in Mark's gospel that is distinguished from the other three gospels.
So now I want to ask you about the Gospel of Matthew. Um, do you believe that that was also an eyewitness account? And what do you see the relationship between Matthew and Mark? Because I do know that you do believe in Mark and priorities. Matthew used Mark,
Mhm.
but how does that work with Matthew being an eyewitness?
So it's a great question, and I've said it before that the Gospel of Matthew is one of the most complex gospels to defend. One of the most complex, and the reason I believe that is because the early church fathers, when they reference the order of the Gospels, it's Matthew first. We look at the data, and it feels like, in my opinion, and I'm not alone on this, that Mark is certainly using Matthew. So how do we reconcile this distinguishing difference, but yet a dependency? But here's the thing. Then you have to deal with the fact that Matthew, so either all the church patristics are wrong, which is what the big Matthean Markan priority debate is about. We have no one saying Mark is first, which I disagree with. It's interesting. Papias starts with Mark and then talks about Matthew. So I don't even necessarily agree with that. But if you look at Matthew the way that Papias talks about it, it's not a Greek Matthew he's referring to. And it doesn't even look like our Matthew because he says it's a logia gospel. It's a sayings gospel in the Hebrew dialect. So I found that interesting. And as I go through and explore this, I end up realizing, hey, there's a conflict between the patristics and the church fathers and the dependency that we see happening. And the church fathers are speaking about some Hebrew Aramaic gospel. And some have made a statement that it is almost of a logia, like Papias, that it is a sayings gospel. So as I began to research this, I did a lot of research on Matthew's gospel. I came to realize that I believe that there actually was an earlier published gospel Matthew himself put out, and that it was actually a gospel that is based on not necessarily the great parables we see or anything like that, although it may have included it. We don't know. We can only really give a hypothetical idea, but more so that it was teachings of Jesus. It was about his teachings, and that it was not done in Greek. It was done in Hebrew Aramaic. And we see examples where Matthew's gospel seems to have been brought over from the Hebrew Aramaic tradition. And we can look at examples of that in just a minute. But specifically, Matthew's gospel, I believe, was published first, not in the form that we have it, but over time, it was used by the churches. I think it involves certain things: Sermon on the Mount, things like prayers of Jesus, the Lord's Prayer, the Olivet Discourse, Great Commission. I think that this early gospel would have continued to have these kinds of teachings. And I think Matthew himself published it because all the evidence of the church fathers, patristics, are telling us this is the gospel of Matthew. Matthew wrote this down. Matthew collected these teachings. We have as much attestation for that as we do for Peter being the author behind the Gospel of Mark. And so what I think ended up happening is it was originally written for the communities of the early Christians. And we know through the Great Commission work that Jesus told the disciples to start in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Well, most of the early Christians would have been a part, especially in the area of Edessa, Antioch, Jerusalem. Aramaic would have been very, very important to have a gospel in its language. But the thing is as the gospel expands beyond those regions, there's going to have to be something put in a different language, because once you leave that territory and you start in Asia Minor and you're over into West toward, Italy and so forth, now all of a sudden the language has changed over to Koine Greek. You need Greek, especially down even in the Alexandria region, though we had Coptic. A lot of them knew Greek as well. So Koine Greek would demand a gospel to be put in that language. So what I think happened is, and this is the short version of it, there was a Hebrew Aramaic that was collected, and Mark's gospel was published in Rome while Peter was there, the way we just described. And it became necessary that in the mother church back in Jerusalem and in the Antioch and Edessa region, that this gospel of Matthew needed to be published from the headquarters church for the churches around the world as the gospel expanded. And that requires putting it in Greek. We actually have statements that Matthew's gospel was translated by key figures and eyewitnesses who produced it. We have the name of Barnabas, we have the name of John, and we have the name of James the Just, who have been attributed to translating Matthew's language over to Greek. And that would make sense for every single one of those, especially Barnabas, who ended up staying in Cyprus. It makes perfect sense, James the Just being at the headquarters of Jerusalem, to be involved in a process like this. So I think, and then we have to, Jacob, think about the fact that Matthew's gospel is the most circulated of the four in the 2nd century. John was not until the 3rd century. Mark has never been the most circulated and cited gospel. In fact, Mark is the least circulated gospel in the 2nd century, because when you look at the citations of Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians, the Didache, it's Matthew the most. It is almost always Matthew's gospel they're citing. And it's the Greek one, by the way. Well, why is that? By the end of the 1st century into the early 2nd century, why is Matthew's gospel the most distributed? Unless it was sent from the headquarters of the main church, the mother church, to be distributed. And we know that they did this because when you go to Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem, we see where proclamations and decisions that were made in Jerusalem were published from Jerusalem and sent to the other churches, specifically about circumcision, how to deal with meat offered to idols and immorality, etc. If the Church of Jerusalem produced a gospel that was actually fully edited and completed and sent by the church itself, all the apostolic group there, then it would be a very circulated and authoritative gospel that far reached some of the others very early on. That's exactly what we see. So I do think that Matthew did collect teachings of Jesus that would have been in that initial Matthew. And I think Matthew, with the help of many others, did a group gospel together in Jerusalem, our Greek gospel of Matthew, and it would have consisted of the original collection of Matthew, corroborated with Peter's testimony. Of course, you're going to use Peter's testimony out of Mark. Why wouldn't you? You have Peter's eyewitness testimony, not in an oral tradition, but a written one. Of course, you're going to use that manuscript. Of course, you're going to use that document to back yours. It brings a consistency to the West and into the central parts there in the Palestinian region to produce a gospel with multiple perspectives. I think it's very possible that the genealogy itself came into Matthew's gospel from the help of James the Just, who is the brother of Jesus. It makes perfect sense that he had that lineage to give to Matthew. So again, there's a lot of reason in the church writings to believe that there was an earlier Matthew that was circulating in the Hebrew Aramaic dialect, but it was necessary for it to be transferred to the rest of the churches in the world by moving it to Greek. And I think it took a group effort in the Church of Jerusalem to produce a text like that.
Yeah, the way I've thought about it in the past, and then the way I still think about it is, and I want to ask you about this because I think this is what you're saying is that Hebrew Matthew, since it was viewed as being earlier, and then the church fathers are saying that Matthew came first. They weren't trying to say the Greek Matthew came first. They really meant Hebrew Matthew came first. But later on, the Greek Matthew got confused with Hebrew Matthew as well. Therefore, creating the Matthean priority we know today.
Yeah, and I mean, we have examples of this. I mean, Irenaeus says that Matthew, indeed, among the Hebrews, in their own dialect, put forth a writing for the gospel while Peter and Paul were in Rome. We also see this in Pontanus, who's recorded by Eusebius, I think it's book 5. He went to India. And when he goes to India, he thinks he's bringing the gospel to them for the very first time. And then he finds out that that's actually not the case, because when he gets there, they already had a gospel of Matthew in their in their possession that apparently the apostle Bartholomew had already brought with him. But he notes that when he found the Matthew that was in India, it wasn't a Greek Matthew. It was a Matthew in Hebrew letters, which means that Bartholomew must have went far east pretty early on, as it relates to bringing the gospel out there. But Pontanus identified one that was in Hebrew already in India. Origen talks about it. He said the first one was written according to Matthew, who was a tax collector, but afterward an apostle. He published it from those in Judea who came to believe and composed it in the Hebrew language and Hebrew letters. I mean, we see the same exact thing. Eusebius says the same things. He preached to the Hebrews, and he was going to the point of others and transmitted in writing his native tongue, their native tongue being Hebrew, the gospel according to himself. Jerome says the same exact thing, that he did it and he wrote it to the Hebrews in their language. So we see this over and over again. They're all talking about a Matthew that was composed originally in the Hebrew language. And again, like, we have to consider a couple other things too. And I mentioned this about the translation. Why is it that we have ideas that the Hebrew Matthew was translated at all? Where's that idea come from? Well, here's one. Athanasius of Alexandria attributes the translation of Matthew to James, the brother of Jesus, in his summary of the Holy Scriptures. He's saying that James, the brother of Jesus, was involved in translating Matthew. Theodorus attributes the translation of Matthew and a participant as Barnabas, who traveled with Paul. He actually says this: the relics of the apostle Barnabas were found in Cyprus under a carob tree, and on his breast there was the gospel of Matthew, written by Barnabas's own hand. Theophylact and Epiphanius attribute the translation to John. In fact, Epiphanius states in his preface, the gospel according to Matthew was written by him in the East, in the Hebraic language and letters, and was published in Jerusalem and later translated by John. So they're all saying that there was there are statements from the church fathers that Matthew did start in one language and was moved to another, and there's a lot of names attached to it. So I actually believe that Matthew's gospel is a group effort. I certainly believe Matthew is involved in it, by the way. I have no reason to believe that he wasn't. I think he started the ball rolling with his own testimony, and it's corroborated with Mark. And now you've attributed extra groups of people in their testimony, like James the Just, like John. Now we know there's other people involved. In fact, we know from quotations later that John the Apostle was fully aware of the other synoptic gospels and actually vouched for their accuracy and truth. Well, why did he have another gospel produced? Well, and we'll find later, it wasn't even his idea, but the gospel of John is produced by John, filling in the gaps where he felt like the synoptics skipped over or started too late, not early enough. But it wouldn't be surprising, based on what we know of John, that he may have had some say-so in what happened in the Gospel of Matthew. So it seems like Matthew is actually not an individual eyewitness perspective, although it started that way. It's corroborated with Peter's eyewitness perspective. So you have Matthew and Peter, potentially others like James, and potentially others like John, and the other apostles who are still around. And it's ironic to me, Jacob, it's ironic to me that when you look at the first century document, the Didache, the teaching of the 12, when it's speaking on behalf of the apostolic group. In the writing, it's a small document. It's not a huge document. There's almost 30 citations. My total estimation in my doctoral work is 29, 25 definitive, 4 debatable. 25 to 30 citations from the Gospel of Matthew in a book the size of one of Paul's epistles. 30. No John, because I think it was written probably about the same time John was written. Very little Luke, and maybe a Mark inflation with Luke. A lot of it is coming from the Gospel of Matthew. And when it refers to the Gospel of Matthew, it commonly uses the liturgical phrase, according to the Gospel of the Lord, which could be attributed to any of the Gospels. But typically in the 2 times it's mentioned in the Didache itself, which is in Didache 8:2, Didache 15:4, it says, as the Lord commanded in his gospel, pray like this, our Father which art in heaven. Then it says, let your prayers and your almsgiving and your deeds be done as you find it in the gospel of the Lord. And then it quotes Matthew. Every single time we see this line, it's quoting the Greek Matthew. So the Greek Matthew must have already been established by the time the Didache is writing, and it is the standard for the apostolic group writing instructions on liturgy and church practice by the end of the first century. And it seems to be the standard gospel being used in that area, which to me would make perfect sense to all the theory that I have behind the Gospel of Matthew to begin with.
So I want to ask you about the stories about the translation of Matthew from Hebrew to Greek, the attribution of the translation to James, Barnabas, and John. So were they all doing this at the same moment, or is each one doing their own separate translation of Hebrew Matthew? What do you think?
I think it would be a group. I think they're all working on it together. But remember, this is something, it's a great question, by the way. Wonderful question. Here's the point, I think, of what's happening. If Matthew's gospel is the most circulated, this would be a time for the apostles who are still in Jerusalem, who are working out, to take this gospel text and their own copy of it to their respected region they're going. Barnabas dies with it on his chest, apparently, according to what we have reported for us. He was buried in Cyprus. He went to Cyprus with Paul. And remember, they split over, guess who? John Mark, his, distant cousin over here, got him in trouble with Paul. He goes back to Cyprus from what we learn in church history. And apparently the gospel text in which he used to the day he died was the Gospel of Matthew. He must have brought Matthew's gospel to Cyprus with him. But it seems to be he was involved not just in the hey, let's talk about this, or don't forget what Jesus said here statements, but he had taken from that established text in Jerusalem his own personalized copy of that text to be the representative text. Jacob, they didn't have email and, stuff like that where they just send it out to the churches. There were respected messengers who took this gospel to be the most circulated. They must have made dozens and dozens of personalized copies of this standardized initial text in Jerusalem to go to the other churches. And what it could mean for Barnabas, for example, is he brought his own text that he personally had his hand on and involvement in to him from Jerusalem to Cyprus. And that James kept his obviously there in Jerusalem, and John took his to the east. John may have brought the gospel of Matthew with him because he doesn't end up producing a gospel until, in my opinion, almost 30 years after the Gospel of Matthew. And it was pressure that forced him to even produce one. I think he would have been content dying without it. He was content with just teaching. So to the answer of your question, the way this got distributed is that, yes, I think they were all involved, but they would have also had, because they didn't have copy machines, they would have had their own personalized copies being the representative initial text and its firsthand copy of it being brought to the regions they're going. And we see this, that Matthew's gospel is being poured out everywhere. Like I said, Pontianus mentions there's a gospel of Matthew in India. I mean, the guy thinks he's bringing the gospel for the first time, and Bartholomew beat him by 100+ years. So it was rapid, but it seems like respected people in the Church of Jerusalem who went to their respected regions to share the gospel took their own personalized hand copies of Matthew that was produced in Jerusalem with them. That's how I would view it.
And one more thing I want to ask you about Hebrew Matthew for now before we move on to Luke is, what do you make of the different church fathers quoting passages from Hebrew Matthew that's not canonical Matthew? Like, for instance, when Jerome's quoting Hebrew Matthew, he talks about, Papias talks about a woman who committed many sins being in the Hebrew gospel. And some wonder if he's talking about the woman caught on adultery or something similar to that.
Yeah,
that is in the Gospel of John, and many think that's a later addition to John because it's missing from earlier manuscripts of John. Yeah. But in Jerome talks about that that in Hebrew Matthew it had James fasting, refusing to eat and drinking until Jesus appeared to him. What do you make of that? And if you think that's in the Hebrew gospel, why is that missing from canonical Matthew?
So here's the problem, and I did my best in a debate recently. Wes Huff and I debated Aaron Abke and Cam Waters. And they're obsessed with the Hebrew Matthew. They don't understand it, but they're obsessed with it. And this is what they fail to understand when the patristics are talking here, especially Jerome. There appears to be a multifaceted elements of gospels that were being produced off of initial Matthean text. And the one that I think you're referring to, that Jerome and others are referring to, and Papias is referring to, is actually in the Gospel of the Hebrews. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that there were other circulating texts. And we always think of the negative of that, like, well, they were all the heretical ones, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Mary, which I've done extensive research on naturally, but those weren't produced till the 2nd century. Remember what Luke said in the preface of his gospel: many have undertaken to write to you an account. Even by the time Luke is producing his gospel, he's admitting there's a lot of accounts trying to produce something of Jesus that just aren't making it. They're failing to produce an accurate account. So he seeks to produce one. So we shouldn't be surprised that there are even orthodox attempts to produce accounts about Jesus's teachings. The story of the woman caught in adultery that seems to be alluded in Papias is talking about a gospel called the Gospel of the Hebrews, which I think Jerome and at times almost conflates with the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. But we have good reason to believe that the Gospel of the Hebrews is actually started in Greek, not in Hebrew, which is ironic. And we have very good reason to believe that it was probably in the region of Alexandria, Egypt, not somewhere near Jerusalem. And we know from Epiphanius and others, and this is what I tried to point out in the debate, that there was a Hebrew Matthew. I just read a statement from Epiphanius where he said there was a translation of it. But he's also telling us that the Ebionites and the Nazarenes had taken a gospel of gospel of Matthew and mutilated it and added and edited teachings of Jesus, like the one you mentioned about James. So when we say that the original Hebrew gospel of Matthew had, say, James fasting, or some sort of story about this, that, or another, we actually don't know if that's referring to the initial text of the Hebrew Matthew or a mutilated form called the Gospel of Matthew. Here's a perfect example, and I'll pull it back up. When Jerome discovered the Hebrew Matthew, a martyr named Pamphilus had left a transcribed copy of it in the library of Caesarea, which makes sense, not far from Jerusalem and Israel's regions. Nobody has this copy by the day of Jerome. Nobody has it. There is and Jerome has unlimited access. I mean, the dude sent teams to Jerusalem to investigate apocryphal writings. I mean, Jerome was not limited in his scope of ability to gain information. Why is it that he gets this copy and then he says that the Nazarenes are wanting a copy? They want him to transcribe. Why? If they already have it. So whatever the Nazarenes and the Ebionite groups that were very faithful to the James the Just, teachings, and Epiphanius and Jerome were telling us they mutilated a lot of the teachings of Matthew and created their own sayings out of it. If they already have the Gospel of Matthew, why, in the Hebrew, why do they need Jerome to help them? Why does Jerome need to produce anything for them if they already have it? See, the point is that by the time Jerome gets onto the process of doing the Latin Vulgate and so forth, the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew was already virtually extinct because they didn't need it. It must have been incomplete. It must not have had everything that they would have wanted in it. But apparently there were some preserved teachings in it that are probably accurate. But what ends up happening is we have like all these statements about the Gospel of the Hebrews, and now we have the Gospel of Matthew. It's like, are they the same? Are they different? What probably happened is the proto-Matthew, the sayings gospel of Matthew that Papias is talking about, that Matthew probably collected, people probably built narrative off of that gospel, including the gospel of Matthew we have. The difference is, why didn't the gospel of the Hebrews make it, which probably used the proto-Matthew in Greek? Why is it that the Ebionite and the Nazarene's gospel has similar sayings or seems to be talking about Matthew's gospel, but it's not the one we got? It seems like what happened is the proto-Matthew was the initial text of the Gospel of Matthew that was used very, very early on in the church. And others attempted to put narrations to a sayings gospel that didn't make it. Luke is telling us many attempted to put together collected accounts that did not make it. Why didn't they make it? Well, because if they're not sent from the apostles themselves, they lack credibility. Luke's gospel, which we'll get into, is backed by Paul. Mark's gospel is backed by Peter. Matthew's gospel is backed by Matthew and the others in Jerusalem. So Matthew, the Greek gospel, continued to make it and it'd be the most advanced of all the synoptics in the world very, very early on, because it was sent from the apostolic church. The gospel of the Hebrews had an unknown provenance, and therefore we don't know the origin of it, even if there are good things in it. There's also some Gnostic ideas that not straight Gnostic, but proto-Gnostic ideas about the pre-existence of Jesus that we find. And by the way, we only have fragmented statements from the gospel of the Hebrews. It's preserved in guys like Origen and quotes from Clement of Alexandria. We start finding some of these quotes. Jerome, they preserve some of the fragmented sections of this so-called gospel of the Hebrews. But it could be that the gospel of the Hebrews is a narrated text that was formed off of the proto-Matthew in Hebrew Aramaic and started adding narration to it, but did not survive antiquity. Doesn't mean it's heretical, but it wasn't formed by the apostolic groups, and therefore it was not seen as authoritative in the church. So it may have had some intrinsic value, but it was not seen as authoritative and established in the church the way we see the other four gospels, because its provenance was not apostolic. It may have been people with good intentions to produce something of narration close to the time of Jesus, which could be where we get the story of the woman caught in adultery. Papias says it comes from the gospel of the Hebrews. Then we go to the writing called the Didaskalia. Didaskalia is the writing of the 12, not to be confused with the Didache. It also has an elaborated form of that story. Then we go to Didymus the Blind, and guess what we find in Didymus the Blind? A similar statement to the gospel of the Hebrews. Where was Didymus the Blind? Oh, he was in Egypt. He was in that part of the world. It could be that story originated from the gospel of the Hebrews that Didaskalia and Didymus the Blind are all using, because it was in that gospel, and it was a great true story that probably happened, but it was never recorded in our synoptics or John. And later it was inserted into John's gospel. And I have a whole theory. I've written a whole paper on this subject of where the story of the woman caught in adultery belongs. I certainly don't believe it belongs in John's gospel. In fact, if there was a place for it to belong, I would put it in Luke's gospel. But it doesn't mean the story isn't true. It may be a little embellished, but it doesn't mean that the story isn't true. But it seems like the provenance in which this story originated was near Alexandria, where the gospel of the Hebrews probably was formed. Didymus the Blind and the school that he has and all the teachings that were preserved there. Didaskalia seems like it comes from more of an Alexandrian school, which may have been preserving a true series and statement and story about Jesus. But it would not have been in the original John, nor would it have been in the original Matthew.
So what's your take on the formation of Luke? Does any of it derive from eyewitness testimony that is distinct from what we get in Matthew and Mark? Or do you look at Luke as being a lot less reliable than the others?
I think Luke is one of the most reliable. Here's why. Not only does he corroborate with Peter's testimony, so we have that from Mark, because I think he's also using Mark. He has eyewitness testimonies that the other synoptics do not have. And Luke's pretty discreet. We could see a timeline in when Luke's gospel was probably written. We can also see the people that he probably used, because he kind of names them without flat out saying, this guy told me. And if you use Luke and Acts together, you actually can see this formation. For example, in the book of Acts, he and Paul spent the evening in Caesarea with Philip and his virgin daughters. And then you go, wait, he was with them even in the narration. That's probably where he got the story about Philip and Samaria and the Ethiopian eunuch earlier in Acts. And so when you actually get into Luke's writing, he starts naming women that you don't even see in the other gospels, like Joanna, who was very, very important, got a lot of money, who helped fund Jesus' ministry. You actually start finding out things from Mary Magdalene that Mark and Matthew don't even make mention of. Mary Magdalene is an instrumental woman in all of the synoptics, and including John. But none of them tell you that she was possessed with 7 demons, unless you hold to the long ending of Mark. But even then, the introduction of her being the woman possessed with 7 demons is kind of random and out of sorts, because he already introduced her earlier in the chapter. The time to introduce a statement of fact about her is the first time you introduce her, not the second, which makes the long ending of Mark problematic, which, by the way, that's a fun discussion of itself, but I certainly believe that Mark, the last 12 verses of Mark, are based on Lucan material. And I've argued that for the last 2 years, and I've actually started to make some headway in scholarship on that subject, because there's complete Lucanism from start to finish in the last 12 verses. But he's the only one that tells you Mary Magdalene was actually possessed with 7 demons. Now he's bringing other people in. 2 disciples on the road of Emmaus. You find that story, by the way. You find it in the Gospel of Mark, not naming any of them. Luke names one, silences the other. Just says 2 disciples were on their way to Emmaus, and it moves on. Again, borrowed from Luke, in my opinion. So when you look at the 2 disciples on the road of Emmaus, he discloses one name who's not mentioned in any of the other Gospels. You don't even know he's a follower of Jesus. You're like, who is this guy? And then he silences the other. This is a technique Luke uses all the time. He silences. It's not because Luke didn't know who he was. He's telling you, it's almost like an ancient footnote. You quote somebody, and then you put their name at the bottom, and you put, footnote 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever number he is. And then you put his quotation, you put the location of which you got that quote. This is an ancient footnote. Silence the one, give credit to the other, and he mentions one of the 2 disciples on the road of Emmaus. And he tells you at the very beginning that he has investigated this thing through those who heard him, the eyewitnesses. So Luke actually has a broader eyewitness coalition going on here to produce his text, which far outreaches Mark and Matthew's, although I think Matthew is very, very much. In fact, I argue the 3 of the 4 Gospels are group Gospels. Matthew is a group gospel project led by Matthew. Luke is a group gospel eyewitness testimony collection that one man collects. And John is a group gospel in its conception. Mark is the only gospel that's not done in a group. It is simply based on one man. And that is why we see the expansion of these gospels, not because they're growing narrative, but because the growing number of witnesses are now starting to tell their story. And it's not just about the apostles. Now Luke has brought people in that are not apostles, but eyewitnesses and apostles. And Paul seems to affirm this gospel. And so Luke's gospel is unique. And that's why I think Luke is one of the most accurate gospels we have of the 4. Not that the others are inaccurate, but as far as precision goes, I think Luke, his gospel is precise and very well documented.
And what are your thoughts on the hypothetical Q source? I do recall that you stated that Q is not necessary. You do believe Luke had access to Matthew. And so what I'll ask you is, do you see Hebrew Matthew that the Hebrew Matthew you're talking about as playing filling in the role of Q.
Yep. Yeah, so this is a great point, Jacob. This is going back to what I was saying earlier. These other gospels that are forming with Matthew's name on it, or the Gospel of Hebrews, if Matthew is a sayings gospel, like Papias says, and people are trying to create narration from it, well, the natural instinctive idea would be, well, here we are. The Gospel of Matthew is being produced, and now other narrations are being formed off of it that would show that it needed a sayings gospel to do that. So I think that the hypothetical Q is not necessary if we have Matthew's eyewitness testimony being corroborated with Mark. You don't need the missing Q that nobody even talks about. And Goodacre, by the way, this isn't like a Christian view. I mean, Dr. Goodacre at Duke University rejects the idea of a Q and thinks it's unnecessary. And I agree with him.
I've had him on before.
Yeah,
I was just
great
saying I've
guy.
had him on before.
Yeah, great guy. And my thing with Dr. Goodacre is that Q's unnecessary, and I think that Dr. Goodacre could go even further. It's unnecessary for more reasons than his. It's unnecessary if you have the eyewitness testimony of Peter and the eyewitness testimony of Matthew together. You don't need a hypothetical Q when you have eyewitnesses involved. You don't need that text. But if there is a sayings text that was collected by Matthew, then that is your hypothetical Q that creates the Greek Matthew and helps form the Greek Luke that we have. So it wouldn't shock me at all. I don't think we need Q. I think the Hebrew Matthew actually fills in the missing link there for us.
Let's go back to the longer ending. So you mentioned earlier about the longer ending is got a lot of connections to Luke. It's got Luke dependency going on. What do you see? Do you see connections with it with John as well? Because the way it talks about Mary Magdalene, and it refers to her having been, it refers to how she went to go see the others, and she told them that, hey, I'd seen the risen Jesus, and in the longer ending, they don't believe her, but in John, it kind of skips that part. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so here's my perspective just on the longer ending. I think Peter's sermon ends in verse 8. He leaves it in a cliffhanger. He leaves it in a question and in an unusual spot. Kind of like tomb's empty. Messages, Jesus is risen. Tells the women, the angel tells the women, go back to Galilee, which he is all about, because Mark's gospel spends quite a bit of time building to that point. It starts building to that point. Jesus said, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be delivered over to the religious leaders. They're going to kill me. And then I'm going to rise again on the third day, and I'm going to meet you in Galilee. We see that in Mark's gospel. Only Mark's gospel has Jesus predicting that location. And then you finally get to the end of Mark's gospel, and Jesus dies, and then he's buried. And then on the third day, there's an empty tomb. There's frantic women. There's an angel. And the message is, tell my brothers and Peter. And the message is to go back and meet him. He's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So Mark's gospel is trying to point out the fact that Jesus has predicted this whole thing from the beginning, and the disciples just did not get it. The women run off, and he says, tell the disciples and Peter. And so they leave scared. Like, what in the world? Like, they're astonished. And then ends with, for they were afraid. But the English translations end kind of in a better way than the Greek, because it ends with the Greek word gar, preposition, for. It's like, what kind of ending is this? If we understand this, there are cliffhanger books that leave things in anticipation, almost like, what are you going to do with the empty tomb? What are you going to do with this message? What are you going to do with Jesus predicting his own death, burial, and resurrection? And then he meets you in Galilee. I think what happened is the initial Mark, the original Mark published, ended there. That was Peter's sermon. I think that it lacked proper ending, and I think that the ending was finished by Mark himself. Here's why. it's clear if Mark did exactly what the early church fathers are telling us, and that is that he wrote down exactly what Peter said. He didn't add to it. He didn't take from it. He did exactly what he was told to do. That means he was under strict dictation. He was following Peter's instruction, and Peter got the final say on what he wrote. We see other books end this way. Jonah, for example, ends kind of in a question. Hey, am I not right to spare Nineveh? Am I not right to spare these children who don't know the difference from their left and their right hand? Am I not right to spare these animals? And then it just kind of ends. Like, Jonah, we're sitting like, did Jonah say yes, God was right? Or did he say, no, you're unfair? I mean, because the book is meant to end in a way that asks us the question, was God right to do that? And I think Peter's ending Mark's gospel, the sermon, the way an orated sermon would end. To me, this shows more evidence of an orated account, Jacob, because it's ending in a question almost. Like the tomb's empty. What you going to do? Like, what are you going to do with the empty tomb? The problem is it's a bad written way to end a text. As I stated to you earlier in the program, Mark's gospel is not good written literature. It is if it's an orated sermon. But here's what I think happened. Because we have early attestation of Mark writing this, because we see multiple church fathers quoting the long ending, including Irenaeus. But it is odd. The language changes. The source is no longer coming from inside the community of the apostles. Seems to be that Matthew 10,000, 1,000 foot view. It's no longer inside the group. It's from above. Something changes. Like I said, you have unusual things like Mary Magdalene shows up on the first day of the week. Then she shows right back up in verse 9. Now, as Jesus had risen early in the first day, it already told us that. Why is this telling us again? Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Again, the way to introduce her as the woman having 7 demons would be when you first introduce her in verse 1, not in verse 9. And there's multiple Lucanisms in this text that you can find in Luke and Acts. Snake bites, not killing people. Oh, that's Acts. Drinking deadly poison is an interesting one because we actually find out that from Papias, believe it or not, that was learned from Philip's daughters, the virgins, stated that Justus, the one that Luke reports as having the lots cast between him and Matthias, and it landed in Matthias, that there's a preserved teaching from Papias from that he learned when he spent time with Philip's daughters in Caesarea, that Justus, one of the eyewitnesses, drank poison. Somebody tried to poison him and it did him no harm. And Luke seems to be a recorder of the stories of Justus because he actually mentions him in the beginning of Acts. It seems like Luke's material is the one being used in the long ending of Mark. Here's the question. Would there have been any time with all these Lucanisms where Mark and Luke cross paths? Just so happens in the biblical narrative, we know that they didn't, or they did, as opposed to Acts where they didn't in Acts. But in 2 Timothy, if you take it to be Pauline, which I do, and it defended the Pauline authorship behind the pastoral epistles, Paul's on his last leg. He's about to die. He's about to be executed. What does he do? He says that nobody stayed with him. They all abandoned him, except one guy, Luke, the physician. He's still with Paul. He tells Timothy to send for his cloak, his books, and one guy. Does anybody remember who the one guy is that Paul requested to be brought to him? John Mark. The question is, why did Paul go on to say, for he is now profitable? He was unprofitable for ministry in Acts. Now he's profitable? What happened between his abandonment of Paul and Barnabas, which split Paul and Barnabas, to Paul's last days in Rome? Something must have happened in Rome, close to Paul, that changed his mind about the profitability of John Mark. Could it be that he wrote a gospel for Peter in Rome, where Paul was, and that gospel had circulated and started making precedence in the Church of Rome, and everybody knew it to be the gospel of Mark? Oh, I think so. And if Mark actually came to Paul, somebody else was still with Paul up to his execution. Luke. So Mark and Luke actually did cross paths based on the request of Paul in the writing of 2 Timothy. Wouldn't it be interesting if Mark and Luke had one day, just give them one day, 24 hours to sit down and talk together? Does anybody think for a minute that they didn't talk about the two accounts that they wrote? Mark wouldn't mention at all the fact that he wrote an account of the life ministry of Jesus for Peter, and Luke wrote an account for all the eyewitnesses. Using Mark's account, Luke used Mark's account. Do you not think if they sat together for 24 hours that somewhere in that discussion they didn't talk about their written accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus? What if, this is a hypothetical idea, what if it was Paul or Luke who encouraged Mark to finish the gospel, but Mark no longer has Peter to help him? We don't know who died first, whether Peter or Paul. There's good arguments that they died around the same time, possibly even around the same day. We don't know. But what if Mark needed help to finish the gospel? What better guy to use and his material, who collected quite a few eyewitnesses, than Luke? What if Mark had been the source behind a lot of Luke's stuff all along, but Mark ends up needing Luke to finish it? So I think the Lucan material in the long ending of Mark comes from their correspondence of meeting each other at Paul's execution. And so I think Mark actually finished the gospel himself. The question is it equal to the rest of the book? And should it be counted as equal to Scripture the way the first 16 chapters up to verse 8 are? Because if it's under the authority of Peter, now we can call it apostolic authority. If it's not under Peter and it's just with Luke and maybe even Mark collaborating together, can we call it equal? Here's how I look at that. I don't know. I look at the long ending of Mark as being historical and accurate and apostolic. To say that it is equal Scripture, I don't know. I leave that for anybody else to judge. I think that we should leave the last 12 verses around with notes just as we see it, but I think some of the footnotes are horrific, by the way, explaining the long ending. I think we need to do a better job of explaining the long ending. But I do think that Mark's gospel may have been completed by Mark himself, and that's where we see the different narration and the different language and a lot of Lucanisms. I think it came from Luke's material, and I think Mark probably completed it because it wasn't really a good ending for written material, but Peter's sermon would have ended there. So then that leaves the debate of, does it belong, does it not belong? I leave that for a lot of people to give their own opinion on. So that's the long answer to the long ending.
Do you think John knew the long ending of Mark or no?
I think he'd have been aware of it by that point. It clearly made it into the Johannine trained community because Irenaeus quotes from it. And Irenaeus is in the school of John. He was trained by Polycarp, who was trained by John himself. So it apparently had been transmitted at least to Ephesus, all the way over to Lyons, where Irenaeus was. So I would say that the Johannine school of teaching, which one generation down goes to Irenaeus, clearly had it. So I'm fine if the long ending made it there.
And how would you address the contradictions that are pointed out by others when looking at the Gospels? Like, okay, how is this eyewitness testimony just conflicts in the resurrection accounts? Matthew and Luke have conflicting genealogies. I know that some say that, okay, one of them's Mary's genealogy, but they both say they're really of Joseph. So how does that work? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think the genealogies are going to be a little bit different at times because their points are different. If you look at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, he's trying to point out that Jesus is the king of the Jews through the Davidic promise all the way back to the seed of Abraham. In fact, we find that emphasized because he mentions Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, which is chronologically out of order. Should be the son of Abraham, the son of David. He's making the point, and even the way that he breaks down the names and the number of people in Matthew's gospel is by the Davidic number. He breaks it down into threes. In fact, I'll turn there to illustrate this for us. It's a great question, by the way, and it deserves attention. I don't think it gets enough attention, so I appreciate the question. I think it's a good one. He breaks it down in verse 17. To all the generations from Abraham to David. Now notice he chronologically does it right there, but go back to verse 1. The recording of the genealogy of Jesus Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Notice the flip. Again, priority in the ancient writing is who you put first typically has greater priority, which shows you the intention of the writer. He's trying to show that Jesus was the rightful king of David, which has to go back to Abraham's roots. But notice this. All the generations to Abraham and David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. Deportation of Babylon to Messiah, 14 generations. 14, 14, 14. So Matthew's already admitting to you, he's not looking for name after name genealogy people. He's clearly skipping people. When he's like, there'll be times where he says so-and-so is the son of so-and-so. He skipped almost 100 years of people in the chronological settings we have in the Old Testament. He's trying to keep it 14 from Abraham all the way up to David, 14 from David to Babylon, 14 from Babylon to Jesus. So there's more than 14 generations in some of those scenarios. Why is he skipping over some of them? He's keeping the Davidic number. Anybody can look this up, by the way. The Davidic number is 14, and it's based on David's name in Hebrew. So if you research that, you'll find the Davidic number is number 14, and Matthew is playing into this, showing that Jesus is the King of the Jews. This is a problem as it relates to how accurate is Matthew's genealogy. If you're talking about the fact that these names are correct and they're actually in Jesus' bloodline, they're accurate. If you're looking for a more extensive list that isn't trying to prove that point, you're going to have to go to Luke. I do think the genealogies could be distinct between Mary and Joseph's genealogy versus legal custody and physical custody. I think there's an argument for that, Jacob. I don't think it should be excluded. But I don't think that's the main argument. I think the main argument is the purpose of Matthew is different than the genealogy purpose. Luke's gospel goes back to Adam, that he is the savior of all mankind. Remember, Luke's gospel is being produced for Gentiles. That's why the Gentiles and the outsiders and the scoundrels are all the heroes in the Gospel of Luke, the Good Samaritan. And you find that Jesus is a savior to the outsider, the despicable, the tax collector, the sinner, the Samaritan. You know, why is that? Well, because the Gospel of Luke is being transported to the Gentile people in Paul's ministry. So this gospel is going to show that Jesus was always in it, not just for the Jew first, but also the Greek. As we find Matthew is focusing on the Jewish people. Luke's focusing on Jesus came to save Gentiles too. And so when we see that, Luke takes the genealogy back to Adam, the first human, because he's the savior of mankind, not just the Jewish people. So even the emphasis between the two are very different, and they have to be laid side by side, or else we're going to come up with some weird theories about the genealogies.
And what about the differences in the resurrection accounts? Like some will point out, like, okay, how many women went to the tomb? There's different numbers, stuff like that. And
yeah, great question again.
Go ahead.
This goes back to who are the women reporting the eyewitness testimony to which guy? Matthew wasn't there. Peter was there later on a second trip. None of these other apostles were there. The only ones that can originally share what happened are the women. I did a project, it wasn't last year, I think it was the year before, with some of my students. One of the things that we pointed out is we wrote down all the people mentioned, the position of the angel, the number of the angels that were giving the message, where they were, timeline. And one of the things I demonstrated it was a wonderful project. And next semester when I teach the Gospels, again, we will absolutely be going over this because it's very, very important. We're going to do the same exact practice. When you look at each writer's account, it's very, very clear that there was more than one trip to the tomb, and they didn't all get there at the same time. And that each writer is distinctly pointing out to an individual woman who's sourcing what they saw. Luke's source is definitely not the same source in Mark. And Luke's source is definitely not the same source in John. So when we actually get to the tomb, we find things different. One angel, two angels, the angel sitting on the stone versus being beside the stone versus being inside the tomb. What's going on here? Remember, if the women had made a decision, all right, let's meet at the tomb. We're going to go anoint Jesus. We had to bury him too quickly. We've been on high Sabbath for the last 3 days. We got to get him anointed with spices, etc. Well, they didn't all come from the same house. I mean, they don't live together. So it could have been this Mary and that Mary were coming from different parts of town to meet at the tomb. Some of the women may have gotten there at one time, and some of the women may have gotten there at 5 minutes later. I don't think they all arrived at the same point. So a lot is happening, and if you actually look at the details and how they shift and change, you can almost see a time lapse that's going on. And one of the things that I pointed out recently, even in the debate, that similar doesn't mean same, and different doesn't mean contradiction. And I think what we start finding in the resurrection narratives is differences, but that doesn't mean contradictions, because it's different perspective. There's a lot of people giving their perspective, and the gospel writers are clearly taking a different perspective from a different person about what they saw. John is actually preoccupied personally with his own attempt to go to the tomb with Peter. And that they actually went to the tomb themselves and they looked inside, they found the sash, they found the cloth, the burial cloth. And then there was this interaction with Mary Magdalene and Jesus, one-on-one. Well, where are the other women? Where'd they go? Was there more than one trip? Did they go back more than one time? You know, there's definitely more than one trip happening. So again, there's a lot there, Jacob, and I know that our time is dwindling here, but it's based on perspective. It's based on which eyewitness is sharing their view. It's based on more than one trip. There could be up to 3 trips that happened to the tomb. And it could be that a lot of the women were actually not arriving exactly at the same time, and they had more than one conversation with these persons who are in the tomb or outside the tomb or sitting on the tombstone or whatever. There's definitely a lot happening, and each gospel writer is picking up at different time lapses.
And so now I want to ask you about John. What kind of eyewitnesses did John have access to? Who are the eyewitnesses that John had access to? And did he also know Mark, Matthew, and Luke in addition to all that? Did he know those gospels?
Yeah, I think he did. John is obviously the main source behind his own gospel. Let me just say this about Luke real quick too, because we spent a lot of time in the long ending of Mark with Luke, but Luke's gospel was approved by Paul. I mean, we see evidence of that through the Muratorian fragment, Anti-Marcionite prologue. I mean, Jerome, Origen. I mean, they're all saying that he was a traveler and a companion with Paul, and he wrote down a gospel, et cetera, et cetera. We actually see the time lapse in Acts where it would work for him to have written a gospel. And there's this giant pause in Acts where time goes by pretty quickly in the text. Like 1 minute, it's like Paul's here, and then boom, we're 9 months later. I think that pause is intriguing to me. I think that in reality, in that time, Luke, we can find corresponding with the we, us, and our passages in Acts. There's a pause, and I think that Luke stopped reporting and collecting things about Paul and just gave a summary about his time in Ephesus, etc. And he focuses on finishing the Gospel of Luke, and he's producing Luke at that point. That's my argument. There's a lot to be said there for time's sake. Maybe that could be another conversation for another day. But Luke's Gospel is in fact, we can see that Paul utilizes Luke's Gospel in 1 Timothy. We can see he elaborates on the teaching of the night of Jesus' betrayal when he institutes the Eucharist in 1 Corinthians. He's clearly using Luke's formation of that story. And we find in Paul writing to Timothy as well as to the Romans, he makes this comment, according to my gospel. And Eusebius points to us, that the ancient fathers have always understood him to be referring to Luke when he said that. He even talks about that Jesus' lineage, according to my gospel, when he writes to Timothy. Well, only two gospels have a lineage, Matthew and Luke. Well, that would make sense. He is mentioned as being the son of David, both in Matthew and in Luke. And we know Paul's being behind Luke's gospel. He's probably referring to the gospel of Luke. I actually believe Luke's gospel was sent to Rome the same time the book of Romans was. I actually think they were sent together. And I think when he was referring to my gospel, he was alluding to the doctrine established in the teachings of Jesus in Luke's gospel. And he goes through and teaches that doctrine thoroughly in the book of Romans as it was sent together. But then that's, again, another perspective that requires extensive time to go through. But Luke's gospel apparently is a collection of gospel or eyewitnesses in his gospel and is approved by Paul. John's gospel is unique. In the anti-Marcionite prologue, John is said to be there while he's still alive, and he's a close disciple. He has a close disciple named Papias, as I mentioned. And notice the quote here. The Gospel of John revealed at the given churches that while John was still in the body, just as Papias of Hierapolis stated, and he related in his exoterics that indeed in his last 5 books, being Papias wrote 5 books, he wrote down, he being Papias, the gospel while John was dictating carefully. So the anti-Marcionite prologue is saying that John is actually narrating a gospel while Papias of Hierapolis is writing it down under dictation. The Muratorian fragment says this: the 4th gospel, that is of John, one of the disciples, when his fellow disciples and bishops entreated him, saying, "Fast now with me for the space of 3 days. Let us recount to each other whatever may be revealed to us." On the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should narrate all things in his name as they, plural, called them to remembrance. What marvel is it that John brings forward these several things? Now, it also goes on to say he professed himself not only to be an eyewitness, but a hearer. And besides that, a historian of the wondrous facts concerning the Lord and their order. So the Muratorian fragment and the anti-Marcionite prologue are telling us that John narrates the gospel, doesn't write it. It even tells us in the Muratorian fragment in the anti-Marcionite prologue that it was Papias of Hierapolis who wrote it for him. But we actually learned that the Muratorian fragment teaches there's a collation going on, a full-fledged collaborating work of the apostles and some of the eyewitnesses who are still alive who want John to put together a narrative. John says, let's fast and pray 3 days. Andrew has it revealed to him, we should do this. You should narrate it as we, all of us, remember things. Isn't it interesting? The first 2 disciples in the Gospel of John are Andrew and the beloved disciple. Isn't it interesting that John's Gospel tells the story of the other apostles, the Synoptics don't? We have statements of Nathanael, Philip, my favorite, Judas, not Iscariot, in John 14, when he says, Lord, will you reveal yourself only to us, or will you also reveal yourselves to others? Multiple apostles are getting speaking lines. There's more voices in John's gospel than any others. Thomas, I will not believe unless I touch the prints. I will not touch unless I touch the wounds. We have statements of Thomas. Where are these coming from? Why all of a sudden do the other apostles have a voice? And if you look at the Gospel of John, it starts on the prologue and the epilogue. We beheld his glory. One of the first times we actually see the personal pronouns used in the gospel, not in the narrated side of it, but in the prologue and the epilogue. And then it talks about the disciple Jesus loved leaning up on Jesus' breast there in the last chapter of John. And then the narrator stops, and then the group comes in and says, and we know the narrator's testimony is true. It's like there's these writers and narrators all involved in this project, and they're telling John's perspective, and they pull out of the narrative for a minute and say, Now, the reason that rumor about this beloved disciple isn't true, John speaks of him and says, because I'm him. I'm the one telling you these things. And then the narrators that are working with him pull themselves out and go, and we know that his testimony is true. There's clearly a group working together producing this text. And they were eyewitnesses because in chapter 1 of in the prologue, it says, and we know, right, in the end, but at the beginning it says, and we beheld his glory. Speaking of Jesus's. So these narrators were all eyewitnesses, but they're within John's authority producing this text. And it seems like they wanted John's authority to produce it. So we see a summary of that just in the Muratorian fragment in the Anti-Marcionite prologue.
So I'm going to take the super chat real quick from Aries Aurelian. Thank you for the super chat. Did Jesus take the fall for the good of all?
I don't know what they mean by take the fall. He certainly sacrificed himself for all. He gave himself a ransom for many. So there wasn't like some conspiratorial taking the fall. He intended to die. I mean, that's the point of Mark's gospel. I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over to the religious leaders. I'm going to die, and I am going to rise again on the third day and meet you in Galilee. All the gospels are saying the same thing. Jesus predicted his own death, burial, and resurrection. So his sacrifice was certainly a petition for those who even says in John's gospel, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then he even says, I lay down my life. I give it and I can take it back. I've been given the authority to lay it down and I've been given the authority to take it up. So yeah, I mean, he took the fall, so to speak, in the sacrificial sense, because he was the Lamb of God that's introduced in John 1, who takes away the sin of the world. And that's how he's introduced on the scene, not after the fact. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, but I don't understand the intentionality behind the question of taking the fall. But yeah, certainly in a sacrificial way.
So one last question I want to ask before we go is, when exactly do you date the Gospels? What order do you put the Gospels in? I'm including Hebrew Matthew as well, and the translations that were done in the middle, in between.
Good question. So I would place the Hebrew Matthew really quickly. Within a couple of years of Jesus' resurrection. I think that the first complete actual gospel narrative is Mark's gospel. I think it was done in the early 50s, around 52 to 54. I think Luke was produced between 56 and 60. I would limit that and narrow that to 58. And I think we can actually date it well through the Anti-Marcionite prologue and the Muratorian fragment and Acts. If we put those three accounts together, we can narrow it down to 2 years in Paul's traveling ministry. So I would place it at the end. Irenaeus hints at Matthew's gospel being done while Peter and Paul were in Rome. Paul does not make it to Rome until after around 60, and he's there for 2 imprisonments. So whenever Irenaeus makes that statement, it could be that the Greek Matthew was produced right at the same time Luke was being produced or shortly after in the early 60s. So I would say that Luke and Matthew were probably being done around the same exact time. It was happening around the same time. Luke's gospel is being published for those in the East. Matthew's gospel is being published for those from the headquarters throughout the whole world. Mark's gospel was published for the Christians in Rome. And John's gospel was eventually be produced for those in the East as produced in Ephesus. I think John's gospel was anywhere between 80 and 90 AD. Some of the early church fathers actually say that John was produced after the apocalypse, which would place that somewhere between 98 and 102. So that's a little late to me. I think John's gospel was done first. I think it was between 80 and 90 AD. I take actually closer to 90 when John's gospel was produced.
So I want to remind everybody real quick that go check out Stephen's YouTube channel. It's tagged in the description below. It's called Facts. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Stephen Boyce.
Absolutely. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Thank you for joining me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.